Alrighty everybody, welcome to downtown Monroe. This is obviously where I live, Monroe, Louisiana. If you've been watching this channel for any time now, you probably know that. Yes, I live in Louisiana, and no, not all of Louisiana is bayous and swamps, though a lot of it is, not all of it. I live in the city of Monroe, Louisiana, which is northeast Louisiana, which is actually where they filmed Duck Dynasty. I'm sure probably most of you have heard of that show at least once or twice by now. But that is all irrelevant information when it comes to this video, because this video, ooh, I'm excited. This video has been requested by a couple of people. This video is all about how to shoot with manual settings with a DSLR. How's it going? Hey. I'm sorry, I'm totally in your way right now. No, you're.
I follow you on Instagram.
Do you really? What's your name?
Clayton. Actually met you at Starbucks.
Did you? Oh, cool. Dude, dope. Yeah. I just started. Thanks, man. I just started doing YouTube just recently as well. So.
You liking it?
Yeah, pretty fun so far. What's your name on Instagram?
Clayton Harris.
Ah, cool. Yeah, I'll go look you up as soon as it finishes. I'll go look you up and go follow you. Cool. Thanks, man. Nice meeting you. Yeah. This cool little thing. Hey, can I put you in my video?
Heck yeah, dude.
100%. This is my new friend Clayton.
Sup?
You guys should go follow him on Instagram. I will link his Instagram handle right here.
Right here.
It's much less.
I've always wanted to do that. I've always wanted to be a part of something.
It's
like drop down.
It's much less cool like when you're actually filming the video because you can't see it. But in the post, trust me, it'll be there.
I know what it feels like now.
So sweet.
Cool.
Follow him on Instagram.
Appreciate it.
Sweet dude. Good meeting, man.
Yeah, you too.
See you around. Yeah. So when it comes to taking photos or video with a DSLR camera, there's three basic settings that you're gonna need to know in order to use the camera in manual mode. There's ISO, there's shutter speed, and then there's aperture. First one we're gonna talk about, obviously ISO, because that's the first one that I brought up. ISO just controls the overall brightness of your image. So you can take your ISO and you can bump it up, and that will brighten your image, or you can bring it back down, and that will darken your image. ISO usually starts around 100, and then depending on the camera that you have, sometimes it'll end as high as 25,000, or sometimes it caps out at 6,400. It just kind of depends on the camera that you have. Now with ISO, you want to make sure that you're not going too bright because it'll start to pixelate your image, especially in the shadows. So you want to be wary of that when it comes to using higher ISOs. The second setting is shutter speed. Now this ultimately decides how much motion blur is in your video or your photos, but specifically we're talking about photos, so let's talk about that a little bit. So shutter speed is generally measured in a fraction of a second, 50th of a second, 250th of a second, 4,000th of a second, and basically what that means is the faster your shutter speed is, the faster that shutter is opening and closing to capture your picture. If it opens and closes really slow, then you're probably going to have motion blur because it's not capturing that moment, it's not capturing that still frame, it's staying open too long. So let's say you're taking a photograph of somebody running. If your shutter speed is too low, chances are that person and the background and everything else is going to be blurry. You have to have an appropriate shutter speed. It'd be best to shoot a higher shutter speed, probably like 400th of a second, 500th of a second, or you can even push it to 1,000th of a second, depending on how much light you have already to work with. Now, one of the downfalls of shutter speed is the higher you go on your shutter speed, yes, you are catching that action, you have a less likely chance of catching any sort of blur, but it also darkens your image. So what do? You have to compensate with ISO. Alright, so to recap, ISO, all it does is just adjust the exposure. It adjusts the brightness and the darkness of your image. That's all it does. Shutter speed adjusts how much motion blur you're going to have in your image. The longer that shutter is open, the more blurry your image is going to be. The faster that shutter opens and closes, the more you're going to catch the person or the subject in that frame, and there's not going to be a whole lot of blur happening. You're just going to catch their hand or the movement or whatever just in that frame. But the higher you go on shutter speed, the darker the image gets, so you're going to have to compensate with ISO. So the last setting is aperture. Now aperture is kind of interesting because it's actually dependent on the lens that you're using. Generally, more expensive lenses have a lower aperture, and we'll talk about that in a second, and then less expensive lenses have a higher aperture. You want a lens that's capable of lower apertures like 1.2, 1.4, or even 2.8. Some of those lenses can get really pricey. For example, the lens that I'm shooting on right now is a 16mm to 35mm, and it's lowest aperture is 2.8 all the way through that focal range. So in a roundabout way of saying it, aperture just determines how blurry and how out of focus the background of your image is going to be. The lower the aperture goes, the more blurry your background's gonna get. Now, another funny fact for you is aperture actually controls your brightness of your image as well. The lower you go on the aperture, the more the aperture inside of your lens opens up, the more light it's letting in. So let's say you're shooting an image with a high shutter speed and you need to let in light, but you don't want to bring in too much ISO because you don't want to get too much grain. What can you do? Well, if you have the wiggle room on your lens, just lower that aperture, open it up a little bit wider, it's going to let more light in, and you can bring your ISO back down to avoid getting grain in your image. Generally, when you see photos of people that look really good or really cinematic, or maybe portraits of people at like weddings or, you know, senior portraits or something like that, what makes those photos really pop is the blurry background. That's because it was shot on a lens with a really fast or a really wide aperture. Again, like 1.4 or 1.8. Now, as I mentioned earlier, when you start looking into lenses with really low apertures, they start getting really expensive. For example, this lens that I'm shooting on, the 16 to 35, this lens cost me about $1,000. Why? A, it's a zoom lens, and B, it has a low aperture of 2.8. As far as Canon cameras go, 2.8 is the lowest aperture you can get when it comes to zoom lenses. Generally, you're gonna see low apertures in fixed prime lenses like a 35 mil or a 50 mil or maybe a 24 mil or something to that effect. Okay, let's recap. Number one, ISO. ISO just adjusts the exposure of your image. It just adjusts how bright your image is or how dark it is. You can bring your ISO up if you don't have a whole lot of light in the room, or you can bring it down if you're outside and it's too bright like it is right now. Shutter speed adjusts the motion blur that's in your image. If you're taking a photograph of somebody running, you need a faster shutter speed to catch that motion, or if you're just taking a picture of somebody sitting down at a table, you can use a lower shutter speed because they're not moving a whole lot. And last but not least is aperture. Aperture just adjusts the blurriness of your background. You almost always want a lens with a low aperture, especially if you're taking portraits of any sort, if you're shooting weddings, if you're shooting videos like this. Just a low aperture means the background's gonna be more blurry, therefore your image is gonna look more professional and more cinematic. And those are the three basic things that you need to know in order to use manual settings on your camera. Hopefully this video was helpful to somebody out there. I know there's dozens upon dozens of videos about how to use manual settings, but I wanted to make this video specifically for people who wanted to hear it in layman's terms. I know for me personally, when I was first learning how to use a camera, a lot of the camera jargon and the camera lingo and that sort of stuff threw me off a little bit, and it made it really tough for me to figure out, and I kind of had to be a little bit more hands-on. Not saying that you shouldn't be hands-on with your camera while you're watching this video, but it's definitely a lot easier if you hear somebody breaking it down into more layman style terms. Thanks so much for watching, everybody. If you don't mind, give it a like or a thumbs up, whatever you're gonna do. It just kind of helps my video make it a little higher up on the list whenever people search for camera basics or manual settings or whatever they're gonna search. Don't forget to comment, because I really like to have conversations with you guys down in the comment sections. And last but not least, please subscribe to this channel. It just kind of helps me. It fuels me to keep going as I'm seeing more and more people show up, more and more people watch the videos and comment and like on the videos. It just kind of fuels the fire, and it honestly helps me when it comes to thinking of ideas for new videos, because I feel like I'm broadening my audience, therefore more people want to see more stuff. And again, it just drives me to keep making more videos. Thank you guys so much for watching. You guys have a good one. Peace.